Active isolated stretching is a new wave of stretching which has taken the world by storm. This technique was created and perfected over the last 30 years by world-renowned therapist and author Aaron Mattis. Aaron's concept is based upon the reciprocal innervation of muscle tissue. This agonist-antagonist stretch reflex allows one muscle group to contract, stretching another muscle group. The stretch is only held for a maximum of 1.5 to 2 seconds, allowing the stretch reflex to work properly. This technique is currently being used by therapists, doctors, and nurses around the world. The fame and rave of the technique has come from the success generated by competition in the Olympic, professional, and amateur ranks. Athletes and therapists have both found a tremendous decrease in the amount of injuries that occur after using AIS stretching technique. Now you will have the tools to increase your skills as a therapist or maximize your athletic potential by using active isolated stretching. Instruct the subject to tuck his chin as close to the neck as possible and contract the anterior muscles of the neck. The therapist assists at the end of the movement. Release to the starting position and repeat. The subject contracts the posterior neck muscles, gently tilting the head backward. At the end of the stretch, he is assisted by the therapist. As the subject tilts his head to one side, staying on the same plane with his eyes focused, he will feel a gentle stretch on the opposite side. The therapist should stabilize the shoulder on the side being stretched to help prevent compensation of the lower spinal area or hiking of the shoulder by the levator scapula. The exercise may be performed in a sitting or supine position. As the subject rotates his head in one direction as far as possible, assist the movement gently with one hand on each side of the head. Have the subject return to a neutral position and repeat the movement. To stretch the left side, the subject will rotate his head at a 45-degree angle to the left, then move the head to the right anterior-laterally at a 45-degree angle. Guide the movement and gently assist the stretch. Release and move back to a neutral position and repeat. The subject should rotate the head at a 45-degree angle, moving posterior obliquely at a 45-degree angle. The ears should move toward the outer border of the shoulder blade. At the end of the active movement, the therapist gently assists the movement for 2 seconds. Release and return to a neutral position. With the therapist standing at the side of the patient, placing one hand on the forehead and the other hand on the thoracic spine, he assists the patient at the end of the active movement. With the therapist standing behind the patient with both hands on the sides of the head, he assists at the end of the movement, preventing any forward elevation. The therapist stands at the top of the patient's head, placing both hands on the front and back of the head. He assists with gentle movement, assisting at the end of the stretch. With a therapist standing at the side of the patient with one hand behind the head, one hand at the lower border of the jaw, assist at the end of the movement. Initiate arm circles toward and away from the body midline. Arms should hang like wet noodles. Lean the body forward, bent knees with tight stomach muscles. Begin with small circles and increase in circumference. Ask the subject to begin with palms facing together and elbows extended in front of the chest. Instruct the subject to reach back as far as possible and offer gentle assistance at the end. Interlock the fingers behind the head. Assist gently at the end of the movement as the subject reaches his elbows backwards. Instruct the subject to extend his arms backwards with elbows locked. Reach as far as possible, providing gentle assistance at the end. With subject's palms facing each other, have the subject move the hands horizontally backward toward the posterior midline. Assist the movement with a brief stretch, release, and repeat. Without bending the body forward, ask the subject to reach his arms upward as far as possible. Lock the elbows with interlaced fingers with the palms facing away from the body. Provide gentle assistance at the end. With the elbow at shoulder height and bent at a 90-degree angle, the subject should externally rotate the shoulder. At the end of movement, the therapist should provide gentle assistance. The therapist should place a stabilizing pressure on the posterior head of the humerus with support underneath the shoulder, instructing the patient to reach his hand up as far as possible with assistance at the end. As the patient internally rotates the shoulder, the assistant stabilizes both at the scapula and at the elbow, assisting at the end of the movement with the internal rotation. With a small bolster placed underneath the shoulder and gentle assistance aiding at the elbow and at the bottom of the hand, the patient will internally rotate the shoulder with gentle assistance at the end of the movement. With an extended elbow, maintaining the shoulder in a parallel position, the subject reaches his arm toward the opposite shoulder with gentle assistance at the end. Instruct the subject to reach his arm toward the opposite shoulder and walk the fingers down the upper back as far as possible. From a position slightly behind the subject, assist at the end of the movement. Flex the elbow at a 90-degree position with the palm facing the back. Stand slightly in front of the patient, assisting him with his movement with gentle assistance at the end of the stretch. Assume a prone position with arms hanging off the table. The shoulders should be flexed, elbow locked, and the palms facing the body. The subject should then reach forward. The assistant guides with one hand with the posterior elbow joint while the stabilizing on back of the shoulder with the other. Repeat and return to starting position. Ask the subject to lock his elbow with his palm facing the body. Stand behind and slightly to the side of the assistant with the same hand on the subject's elbow. Subject raises the arm as high as possible without bending or arching the back. Assist and release and return to the other side after each repetition. Ask the subject to lock the elbow with the palm facing forward, reach as high as possible. Stabilize the shoulder and provide assistance to movement by placing the other hand on the back of the elbow. Release and return to starting position. Position the upper arm vertically near the neck. Downward lateral rotation, the triceps, serratus anterior, and upper pectoral fibers are stretched. Position the lower arm reaching toward the top arm and assist with a rope or with gentle assistance from the assistant. Straighten the elbow with palms facing downward. Extend the wrist and fingers backward as far as possible with assistance from the therapist helping at the end of the stretch. Extend the elbow, slowly flex the wrist downward by contracting the wrist flexor muscles. Apply a gentle stretch with assistance at the end of the movement. Flex the wrist into abduction by contracting the distal end of the radius, moving the thumb and fingers toward the wrist. Gentle assistance may be applied by an assistant at the end of the movement. Extend the wrist into adduction by contracting the distal end of the ulna, moving the little finger and remaining fingers toward the same side of the wrist with gentle assistance at the end of movement from the therapist. Extend the fingers backward with gentle assistance from the therapist or using the opposite hand. Release and repeat. Flex the fingers downward by contracting the flexor muscles. Flex the wrist as far as possible and assist with the opposite hand or with gentle assistance from a therapist. From a seated position, with gentle assistance from the therapist, spread the fingers as wide as possible and have the therapist gently assist to help loosen the webs. Placing your hand with the palm facing away from the body with your thumb at a 90-degree angle, have gentle assistance from a therapist to move the thumb backwards to a terminal point. Abduct the thumb horizontally, moving the thumb laterally away from the index finger. Contracting the abductor hallucis longus and brevis, stretch the web with gentle assistance from the therapist. Contracting the adductor pollicis longus and adductor pollicis brevis, actively move the thumb over the top of the neighboring index finger with gentle assistance from the therapist. Contracting the opponent's pollicis flexor pollicis brevis, adductor pollicis, actively contract the muscles of opposition by moving the thumb towards the base of the little finger. Contracting the hip flexor and abdominal muscles, ask the subject to flex the exercising knee and pull it toward the armpit. The subject may place his hands behind the thigh to prevent pressure on the knee. Provide slight assistance at the end of movement. The therapist should assist by placing distal hand under the foot of the subject's active leg and proximal hand under the mid to lower thigh. The subject should begin with knees and hips flexed at a 90-degree angle with thighs pointed vertical. The subject should exhale and contract the hip flexors and abdominal muscles. Pull the thighs toward the armpits. Ask the subject to contract the anterior thigh muscles and extend the knee as far as possible. Use gentle assistance from the therapist or from a rope to assist. To isolate the distal attachments of the semitendinosus and membranosus, rotate the lower leg outward as far as possible. Extend the knee completely with gentle assistance. To isolate the distal attachments of the biceps femoris, rotate the lower leg inward completely as far as possible. Assist at the end of the stretch with a therapist or a rope. With the exercising leg knee locked straight and the non-exercising leg bent, lift the leg as far as possible, stretching out the hamstrings. Provide gentle assistance at the end of the stretch. To isolate the proximal attachments of the semitendinosus and membranosus, ask the patient to keep his knee fully extended and the femur and upper leg turned inward. Assist at the end with gentle assistance from the therapist. To isolate the proximal attachment of the biceps femoris, keep the leg in a straightened position with the leg externally rotated. Assist at the end of the movement by the therapist and the rope. Ask the subject to lock his knee and rotate the entire leg slightly inward, spreading the leg outward as far as possible with gentle guidance and assistance provided by the therapist. To isolate the adductor magnus most effectively, extend the knee and hip outward at a 45-degree external rotation and spread the leg downward as far as possible with assistance. The third part of the stretch, he maintains an internal rotation, lifting the leg vertically at a 45-degree angle while maintaining an extended knee. The subject should externally rotate the femur and contract the inner thigh muscles to bring the leg across the midline of the body with gentle assistance from the therapist. From a prone position, have the subject lean across the table with the upper body and pelvis supported on the table. Place the non-exercising leg about 18 inches beyond the proximal end of the table. Assist as he reaches his gluteal muscles upward with gentle assistance at the end of the stretch. From a side-lying position with the front leg cradled, reach the back leg back as far as you can with gentle assistance from the therapist. The second part of the stretch, contract the hamstring muscles, bringing the upper leg and foot back toward the gluteal area. On the third part, reach with your hand holding the ankle backward as far as possible. Instruct the patient to place a rope around the midfoot and clasp with the same side hand. The therapist should place the opposite hand on the knee above the knee to stabilize the femur. Instruct the patient to rotate the hip by moving the lower leg away from the midline. Assist at the end of the movement. The pelvis must be stabilized with one or more seat belts to prevent any pelvis movement. The subject should assume a prone position with the knee flexed at 90 degrees, externally rotate with assistance from the therapist. From a supine position, the patient should flex the knee joints to a 90-degree angle, stabilize the pelvic girdle with a seat belt, and internally rotate the femur to a 90-degree angle or beyond with gentle assistance from the therapist. With the patient in a prone position with the pelvis stabilized by a seatbelt, place one hand near the inside of the lower thigh or knee, and the opposite hand is placed on the outside of the lower leg. From an initial position, rotate the hip outward to guide the stretch of the gluteus medius and tensor fasciae lata. Stabilize the pelvis by moving the non-exercising leg across the midline and rotating the same leg inward extreme. A pad or seatbelt may also be used to stabilize the patient. Moving the exercising leg towards the bottom of the opposite breast, the therapist should help by placing his hand on the knee and leg, bringing it across the midline. The subject should rotate the non-exercising leg inward and hyperadduct across the midline as far as possible. Instruct the subject to stretch the opposite side leg by extending the knee within 10 degrees of full extension. With the subject seated with his knees bent, have him exhale and slowly come forward, curling his body toward the ground with gentle assistance from the therapist. Subject may sit with one leg straight and flex the opposite knee to 90 degrees, or bend his knee slightly and spread his legs farther than shoulder width apart, placing his elbow to the opposite side leg and turning as far as possible with gentle assistance from the therapist. From a seated position with the feet slightly wider than shoulder widths apart, the hands are clasped behind the head and knees are flexed. Instruct the patient to flex the lower elbow close to the opposite side of the chest. Tuck the chin, exhale, and contract the abdominals with guidance from the therapist to bring them down toward the floor. Instruct and assist the subject with feet shoulder width apart and pelvis horizontally level. Slowly, the subject will lean laterally, directly over the side of the pelvis as far as possible, with assistance from the therapist. For greater stretching capability, he may rotate both to the front and to the back at a 45-degree angle to stretch out the abdominals or the lower back. The therapist should stabilize the lower region of the thoracic spine by placing a pad and strap across the T9-T10 region and apply firm pressure to the area and also seat belting the ankles. He will assist as he rolls his shoulders backward, reaching toward the sky. With the knee bent at 90 degrees, if possible, have the patient dorsiflex the ankle. Assist the patient at the end of movement. Flexing the knee at 90 degrees, brace the knee against the shoulder. Have the patient dorsiflex the ankle. Assist the patient at the end of dorsiflexion. The subject should bend his knee as completely as capable, having the patient attempt to move the foot toward the shin. The therapist should assist by placing his hands under the ball of the foot. From a seated position with his knee locked, the subject will dorsiflex the foot and ankle back as far as possible. The therapist will assist by helping him pull back the foot at the active range of motion. The patient's ankle will be at 90 degrees and will attempt to turn the foot and ankle area outward as far as possible with gentle assistance from the therapist. Maintain the patient's ankle at near 90-degree angle as possible. Turn the ankle foot inward with the therapist gently assisting the motion with one hand around the heel and around the midfoot. Have the subject plantar flex the foot and ankle downward, toes pointing toward the surface. Have the subject attempt to extend the toes upward with active contraction of foot extensors. Stretch one toe at a time, including the big toe. Stabilize on the proximal side of the distal joint with the thumb and index finger to isolate the distal phalanx. This stretch is especially beneficial for people with limited flexion or hammered toes. Have the subject flex the toes downward with active contraction with assistance at the end, one toe at a time. The therapist should stabilize the area just above the proximal great toe with one thumb and index finger. Ask the subject to extend the big toe upward by contracting the muscles on the top of the big toe. The therapist can then gently assist with a free thumb and index finger. Ask the subject to bend the big toe downward. Gently assist the movement. Also assist down and obliquely outward at a 45-degree angle to stretch the adductor hallucis muscles. Lifting the little toe upward, assist the active subject's effort with the thumb and index finger.
Thank you for allowing us to share our innovative stretching and rehabilitation techniques with you. Active isolated stretching has been in development for over 30 years, and we're grateful for being able to pass it on to you. The following photos are of other products that may be helpful for you. Please feel free to call us, and please visit our website at www.stretchingusa.com.